Welcome, my name is Crystal Appia, and I'm moderating today's symposium on resistance, reflections on power and solidarity in BIPOC archives, with panelists from the Outreach Working Group of the Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage at Rare Book School. Just going to start with some housekeeping items. As Marion has mentioned, we would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be shared later on Rare Book School's YouTube page. We ask that everyone stay muted if you're not speaking, and we'll be taking questions from the audience at the end of all the presentations. You can drop your questions in the chat at any time. If you do ask a question, would you indicate if it's for a particular panelist or if it's for the entire group? This program is part of the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage at Rare Book School, which is a 6-year program that aims to advance multicultural collections through innovative and inclusive curatorial practice and leadership. Among the program activities, fellows participate in an intensive 1-year project on one of 3 themes. And our panelists today selected the working group that focuses on the theme of community outreach. I've been working with them over the past year to facilitate the process from brainstorming to the final realization of their project, which is this symposium and a zine on the subject of resistance. I want to say it's been an honor to work with this group. I've been really proud of what you've been able to accomplish, especially in the midst of a pandemic and being geographically dispersed and with the competing demands of family life and work commitments. And before I turn it over to the panelists, I would like to thank Rare Book School, especially Marian Toledo Candelaria, the program manager for the fellowship, who's been just an example of grace and efficiency in helping us realize these projects. So thank you, Marian. And so I'd now like to turn the program over to Sandy Enriquez, the Special Collections, Public Services, Outreach, and Community Engagement Librarian at UC Riverside.
Awesome. Thank you, Crystal. And hello, everybody. I'm honored to begin our talk today by sharing with you some information from behind the zine. Marian, if you can go to next slide, please. Going over some of the basics of how we created the zine, why we created the zine, and then I'll share a little bit of information about my own contribution to this project. Next slide, please. So first off, why a zine? Well, there are multiple reasons for sure, but to start, we wanted to give insight into the valuable stories in our collections from our own perspectives as library workers of color. And we hope that this zine will ultimately help drive research interest in these collections and be a way to share lesser known stories with the public. And personally, for me, one of the most important reasons to make a zine was to challenge the perception that archives are only functional for traditional research use. Of course, a primary function of archives is research, but I think that we should also expand our definition of archives to include more creative and progressive functions as well, always keeping in mind ethics and ethical use, of course. But I think this is particularly important because so many underrepresented groups feel uncomfortable in archives or in research spaces. So having different functions for archives can help rebuild those connections between BIPOC communities and BIPOC materials. And lastly, we wanted to partake and continue this tradition of zines as a way, a very accessible way to share information widely, freely, and ethically. Next slide, please. We were also really intentional with the title of this zine. We wanted to focus on reflections because we didn't want this to just be summaries of collections or statements about collections. We really wanted to honor everyone's individual interests and perspectives. So we felt that reflections was a great way to conceptualize all of our different connections to these archives. Some of us made our content more educational, some of them made it more advocacy focused, and some, like my own, is more about a connection to a one person's story rather than one particular collection itself. So in a way, the zine is really about describing BIPOC collections, but also describing our connections to them as BIPOC library workers. Next slide. And to give you an idea of how I plan to use the zine in my outreach here at UCR, these are some of the ways. As in tabling events, I think the zine is very eye-catching and it'd be a great conversation starter just to have out on a table if you're at a fair or other kind of outreach event. On display in your own reading room as well. We already have the zine on display and I've already had to refill the little holder because folks come by to the front desk and it's really easy for our student workers to kind of share the zine as a way to introduce people to what special collections and archives could be. Also including the zine in swag bags. So whenever we're doing kind of scavenger hunts or just fun little competitions in the library, it's a really easy part to add to a bag with other information about the library services. And then lastly, my most favorite option is also using it as a model and an example of different projects we can do with faculty and students. So I know in my case, I often meet with faculty that are really interested in working with special collections on a tangible end product. And that end product tends to be a digital exhibit or a physical exhibit of some kind. But exhibits can take a lot of time to build, right? And sometimes we don't always have the resources for it. But a zine is something that's a lot more accessible and I think still has that still fulfills the need for curation and creativity. So I think this is going to be a great tool to share with faculty members. Next slide. And lastly, these are the tools that we use to make our zine. We relied really heavily on Google Drive. That's where everyone uploaded their content and their images and text. And then we used Canva, which is a free program. We just had the free account to synchronously or asynchronously be able to edit the document, the zine collaboratively. So if you haven't used Canva before, it's actually really similar to Google Docs. You're able to synchronously edit and add comments like you see in the image here. So I highly recommend these tools. And then optionally, you could use Microsoft Word to collate the file for printing, you know, DIY printing at your own office, or there's other programs as well to do that. Next slide. So now I'll be pivoting from talking about the zine broadly to talking about my individual contribution, which was titled, We Will Unite, Remembering Jessie Salcido. And in my case, I didn't focus on one single collection. I actually traced one person's story across multiple collections at UCR and beyond. And doing this gave me a deeper understanding of how Jessie Salcido's story has impacted the local Chicano community here in Riverside and how that community resisted the dominant narrative about Salcido's death. So while I took a very meandering path to researching Salcido's story, for the sake of time today, I'll be sharing his story with you through a chronological timeline with examples of the documents that I found. And at the end, I'll show you how I remixed those documents into my zine spread. Next slide. So Jessie Salcido was a 17-year-old Chicano high school student living in Riverside, California. On the night of February 22nd, 1969, he was tragically shot 3 times and killed while fleeing from a white police officer, James D. Willingston of Riverside PD. And unfortunately, I don't have time today to go into the specifics of his case, but suffice to say, this was a heart-wrenching tragedy for the Chicano community of this area. And here we see a newspaper clipping about Salcido's death that a colleague at Riverside Public Library shared with me. Because here at UCR, we don't have materials about the first night that the tragedy occurred. What we have really focuses on the resistance and the protests that occurred after the shooting. Next slide. Almost immediately after Salcido's death, the local Chicano Mexican-American community began to organize. They started holding a community meeting at the local Villegas Park, and you can see that mentioned in one of the newspaper headlines that I have an excerpt of here. And at that meeting, they were demanding an inquest into his death. So they wanted a coroner to examine the body and determine if this was justifiable or unjustifiable homicide. And here we see a flyer, the yellow document, which is from one of our collections here at UCR. This is from UA 133, Collection of Race, Ethnicity, and Student Activism. And on the front side of the flyer, we have information about this community meeting. And on the back, you can see a hand-drawn map showing where the community was going to do a funeral march before gathering to demand the inquest. And I actually found this flyer because I was preparing for a separate workshop and I was researching this collection. And it really drew me in because as a Latinx person living in Riverside, I felt like I needed to really know more about Jessie's story and remember his story, especially for many of us, having lived through the past few years and seeing the rise of Black Lives Matters and other social justice movements. It's really pushing us to be more aware of these structural inequalities and the conditions that BIPOC communities face today. And seeing this flyer from the 70s is a reminder that our struggles are not new. Our communities have been resisting and organizing over countless generations. Next slide. And in my research, I learned that on March 3rd, the coroner's jury unfortunately returned a verdict of justifiable homicide, meaning that Officer Willingston would not be held accountable for Salcido's death. So while this was incredibly disheartening, it was also not surprising. And around the time I was doing this research, we actually just finished digitizing our student newspaper, The Highlander. So the first thing I did was search for Saucedo's name and see if there was any information. And I was able to find this article, which highlights the students participating in the post-verdict protests. Next slide. I think it's important to point out that it wasn't just UCR students participating in the protests, it was also UCR faculty and staff, as we see demonstrated here. This is a flyer from the same collection as before, UA 133, but this time it's promoting a Chicano peace rally. And this is to create a space for the community to heal and unite after the announcement of the verdict. And we see Dr. Cota-Robles named here. He's also interviewed in several of the newspaper coverage of this story. And Dr. Cota-Robles was one of only 2 Chicano faculty at UCR at the time. So he was a very strong advocate for Chicano students and other underrepresented students. And I also share another headline here that says tensions may forge unity among Mexican Americans, because I do think it was true that Saucedo's death, while very tragic, also created a huge push for unity and organizing among the local community with long-lasting results even years later. So I'll share a few examples of that as I wrap up my presentation for today. Next slide. So fast forwarding 4 years later, after Saucedo's death, a graduate student at UCR named Paul Villafora writes a manuscript about the Mexican-American experience in Riverside. And in that manuscript, he cites Saucedo's death as the catalyst for the formation of the first Riverside chapter of the Brown Berets, which for folks who don't know, was a community-based social justice group that played a huge role in the Chicano civil rights movement. So a very major pivotal moment for the Riverside Chicano community. Next slide. Fast forwarding 1 more year, this is the final document that I could find at my institution about Jesse Saucedo. This is a community newspaper called The People's Voice, and they highlighted Saucedo's story as a part of a call to action for the community. So this is located in a different collection than the other flyers I showed you. This one is from UA 132, the Robert J. Chandler collection on student activism. But I wanted to share it because I really think it shows the lasting and ongoing impact of Saucedo's story to the local community. Next slide. So to end my presentation, I just wanted to share some information I wanted to share how this information and research can translate to a zine spread. You may recognize some of the documents that I showed earlier here. Some of them are a little more remixed than others, but I hope this gives you an idea of how zines can be used to convey the importance of our collections, particularly our BIPOC collections on resistance. So thank you. I was now supposed to welcome Zaida Delgado, Special Collections Librarian and Archivist from Sonoma County History and Genealogy Library. However, she is unfortunately unable to join us today. Can we show a next slide? Thank you. So this was Zaida's presentation here. She sends her best regards to everyone and apologizes for being unable to attend today's presentation. But if you do have questions about her zine contribution, please contact her directly at zdelgado@sonomalibrary.org. And I'm now pleased to welcome our next speaker, Suzanne Im, Senior Librarian in Digitization and Special Collections at the Los Angeles Public Library.
Thank you, Sandy. Hello, everyone. So in reflecting on manifestations of resistance in the Los Angeles Public Library's special collections, I decided to highlight BIPOC-created cookbooks. So an essential aspect of resistance is community building and recuperation, which is often done when people, quote, break bread around the table. Moreover, food traditions that have been passed on are more than just recipes. They're windows into the culture, history, and struggle of those who came before. Next slide, please. This first cookbook featured here is the one that's I had featured in the zine. It's the Anak Pawis cookbook created around 1975 by the Los Angeles chapter of the anti-imperialist, anti-racist Katipunan ng Mga Demokratikong Pilipino, which is KDP for short. They were also known in English as the Union of Democratic Filipinos. They embraced the dual goal of establishing socialism in the US, as well as supporting the national democratic movement led by the Communist Party of the Philippines in opposition to the regime of dictator Ferdinand Marcos, who had established martial law when he seized power in their homeland. At its height, in the mid-1970s, the KDP as an activist organization was comparatively small, with an estimated 200 to 300 members drawn from different political and social movements. However, they covered a wide geographic territory from New York to Guam and Canada, and activated the Filipino American community around many issues, including immigration, deportation, housing, and police conduct. By the way, the Special Collections at Cal State University Dominguez Hills holds quite a bit of archival material related to the KDP, including a complete run of their newspaper for anyone who's interested in learning more about the group. The Los Angeles KDP chapter was a very active group. The creation of the Anakpawis cookbook was one of several types of fundraisers they ran to support the KDP's work in Filipino communities throughout the US. The recipes that I chose to include here, Antonia's squid adobo, which adobo is a type of marinade, and pancit guisado. Pancit is a type of stir-fried noodle. These recipes, to quote from the forward, because of their historical interactions with other cultures, including China, Spain, and Portugal, the Filipinos have a variety of recipes and ingredients that show how culturally rich the country is. Next slide, please. From here, I'm excited to highlight two recent purchases made for the Los Angeles Public Library's Rare Cookbook Collection, following the vein of resistance, and also demonstrating our department's commitment to collecting materials written about and, when possible, by BIPOC folks. The Digitization and Special Collections Department is currently working on updating our collection development policy and strategic plan with quantifiable benchmarks for acquiring materials representing the diverse communities of Los Angeles based on census and other demographic data. With the realization that we may not always meet these benchmarks on an annual basis, formalizing these goals will ensure that the library makes a concerted effort to reach specified underrepresented groups as regards special collections, regardless of staff composition. To cite one benchmark we are considering, 11.8% of the population of the city of LA identifies as Asian, which in itself is a diverse amalgamation. Yet material on the Asian and Asian diaspora in the rare book collections comprise approximately 0.001%. And so here I have the first book purchase that I wanted to talk about, which is Good Things to Eat, as presented by Rufus Estes, published in 1911. This title was self-published by Estes, who was an African-American chef born into slavery in Tennessee in 1857. This cookbook has almost 600 recipes where Estes featured Southern cuisine with African roots and added a hearty dose of French influence. And some of the recipes included here, among them are chicken gumbo, squash flour omelet, beef marrow quenelles, turkey truffles, Southern style waffles, among others, running the gamut from haute cuisine to family style entrees. Estes had worked for 14 years as a chef in deluxe private railroad cars for the Pullman Company, where he honed his culinary skills preparing meals for celebrities, industry magnates, and American presidents. He later moved on to become a caterer to executives with the US Steel Corporation, which was the first billion-dollar corporation in the world. If any of you have not yet seen High in the Hog, there's a really great episode, the third episode, that talks about chefs and caterers in the Black community. Next slide, please. Finally, I have here presented Nuevo y Sencillo Arte de Cocina, Repostería y Refrescos, published in 1836 by Antonia Carrillo. This is the first edition of the first printed cookbook by a woman author in Mexico, with hundreds of recipes for traditional dishes, desserts, and drinks. And this book was advertised specifically as accommodating to the Mexican palate. And you don't see as much of the French and continental cuisine influence in this first edition as you do in later 19th century cookbooks in Mexico. This edition, this first one, actually does not indicate the author was a female, and this only becomes apparent by the third edition published in 1865, which credits Antonia Carrillo as the author. And this book is a rare example illustrating early New World food and wine types written by women during a time when female authors were not common. Next slide, please. So I thank you for your time, attention, and this opportunity to pique researchers' interest so they may delve deeper into special collections and uncover more about some of these figures and foodways in culinary history. My contact information is here if you have any questions, and if you haven't already, please follow our department's Instagram page on at @LAPL_special collections to hear more about how our collections are being shaped. And I am now pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is Jessica Tai, resident processing archivist at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Suzanne, for the introduction. Again, I'm Jessica Tai, and today I'll be speaking about the materials that I included in my zine contribution, which include the Lisbeth Telfison papers and materials documenting Aceh magazine. Next slide, please. So Lisbeth Telfison, who's second from right in this image here, is an Oakland, California-based political activist, feminist, and community organizer. Telfison is also a curator and a collector who focuses on late 20th century African Americana with specializations including the Black Panther Party, Angela Davis, Black LGBT culture, and political graphics. And in 1989, Telfison co-founded Aceh with Pippa Fleming. Aceh was a free journal and community organization for, by, and about Black lesbians. Next slide, please. So the collection includes material relating to Aceh, including correspondence, photographs, business records, event flyers and calendars, writing submissions, artwork, and magazine layouts. And the collection was purchased by the Beinecke in 2012 from Bolarium Books, who are book dealers that specialize in the history of grassroots social movements. Tim Young, who is the curator of modern books and manuscripts at Beinecke, helped bring the archive to the Beinecke and uses the collection and instruction sessions focused on the process of creating a magazine. And the collection is also used to teach about the formats that queer activists of color have used to make their voices heard and methods of community building before the prevalence of the internet. Next slide. So Aceh played a major role in organizing, making visible, and creating alliances, both locally and internationally, in the Bay Area Black, lesbian, and Black LGBTQ communities. Although it had a relatively short run, it was published from 1989 to 1993. It was widely influential as a literary journal, as well as an activist organization and community builder. Aceh facilitated conversations and published literary works and artwork exploring diverse themes and answering underexplored questions, some of which are posed from this clipping from the magazine that you can see here. Next slide. So here's a selection of flyers from the collection. Aceh's programming was really diverse. It featured dance parties, documentary screenings, lectures. Next slide. And workshops and live music. You'll also see on this slide here an events flyer, which were distributed around the East Bay area to advertise their programming. These were particularly fun for me to go through as I grew up in Oakland and I recognized a lot of the venues that they hosted their events in. Actually, Asmara, where you can see they hosted the Soul to Salsa dance party is still around. So if you're ever in Oakland and looking for some really delicious Ethiopian food, I highly recommend checking it out. Next slide. So Ache would also curate calendars to highlight relevant television programming, theater shows, nightlife, radio programs, films, and music events, as seen in this calendar here from February 1989. Next slide. Ache was a really incredible resource for the Bay Area, as well as the national Black lesbian community. In the words of Audre Lorde, the existence of Ache is a deep and satisfying joy to me. It is important that we encourage and support an organ of communication exploring the potentials of Black lesbian communities. Or from this anonymous reader who stated, I can't tell you what Ache has done for me. I'm just coming out and I don't know any Black lesbians. I read each journal from cover to cover. I don't want to miss a word. Ache makes me feel a part of it all. Thanks so much. And now I'll pass the mic to Bridgett Pride, former reference librarian of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library.
Thank you so much. So the Schomburg Center does a marvelous job of documenting resistance in the Black diaspora. Next slide, please. Arturo Alfonso Schomburg grew up in Puerto Rico, and we are told, asked one of his teachers when he was growing up how he could learn more about Black history. Unfortunately, his teacher told him that Black people had not created anything or done anything worthy of study, but he knew that was wrong. So he dedicated his life's work to collecting thousands of items from around the world, documenting Black history, creativity, and Black genius. He called these items vindicating evidences. In 1926, he sold thousands of these items to the New York Public Library. They were deposited at the 135th Street Branch Library in Harlem to serve the Black community there. These few thousand items were cared for by the first New York Public Library Black librarian, Kathryn, and have been growing to their current 11 million items housed at the Schomburg Center today. Next slide, please. In May of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, I set about creating a research guide that would document Black protest and resistance at the Schomburg Center. I found hundreds of collections across the 5 research divisions that tell of the heartache, resilience, and fight of members of the Black diaspora. This guide serves to educate our global user base. It also was meant to help me and our community process our grief and provide hope. Next slide, please. When I began researching for this project, I was really struggling and deciding just one collection to talk about. And I decided on the Claudia Jones Memorial Collection. And that was because even at the Schomburg, the stories of Black women are not celebrated as regularly as the stories of Black men. And I knew I wanted to give voice to more Black women. So across the Schomburg Center, Claudia Jones shows up in multiple divisions. I selected the Memorial Collection because it focuses on materials that she collaborated and put together. We also have a bunch of photographs that came in with her papers. So Jones was born in Trinidad in 1915 and moved to the United States with her parents and siblings in 1924. They settled in Harlem, New York, and struggled for some time. Claudia's mother passed away a few years after arriving, and Claudia was frequently ill due to challenging living conditions. Nevertheless, she did well in school and worked odd jobs in Harlem, including a laundry and starting Claudia's column in a local newspaper. Slide. In 1936, Jones had a sort of activist awakening, joining the Young Communist League to better support the Scottsboro Boys. From here, her journalism career took off as she joined the editorial staff of the Daily Worker. She used her platform as a journalist to speak out against racism and sexism, and was even critical of the Communist parties at times. Her friend and colleague, Paul Robeson, had this to say about her. Indeed, in her dedicated work and leadership, Claudia has given new life to the finest traditions of our country. She has continued in our day the heroic tradition of Harriet Tubman, of Sojourner Truth, the struggle for Negro liberation, for women's rights, for human dignity and fulfillment. Next slide, please. Jones was appointed editor of the Negro Affairs for the Daily Worker in 1948, and that same year she was arrested for a violation of the Smith Act. She was accused of un-American activities and of using journalism to incite a violent overthrow of the US government. Between 1948 and 1955, Jones was arrested and imprisoned twice, and finally deported to England in December of 1955 after serving a sentence of a year and a day at the Alderson Federal Women's Prison. The Claudia Jones Memorial Collection includes many telegrams, cards, and letters from her friends and colleagues, sending her well wishes as she prepared for deportation. This one says, "Your Chicago friends send you warmest greetings on this occasion. The enemy may have had his hour of triumph in your deportation, but the days and years of struggle and victories belong to us, and we shall always remember your dedication to the struggle and victories. May you enjoy good health and fruitful activity. Au revoir." Next slide. From 1955 until her death in December 1964, Jones continued to fight for Black liberation. She worked with London's African Caribbean community, doing political and cultural organizing. She founded and edited the West Indian Gazette and the Afro-Asian Caribbean News. She resisted governments designed to make her and people of African diaspora small. I hope that you will reach out to my colleagues at the Schomburg and learn more about Jones and the hundreds of others who dedicated themselves to Black liberation. And with that, I would like to turn our program over to my colleague, Jina Duvernay, a Getty Images consultant.
Thank you, Bridgett. Hi there, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. For the next few minutes, I am going to highlight journalist and civil rights activist Almina Lomax, whose papers are located at Emory University's Stuart A. Rose Manuscript, Archives, and Rare Book Library. Upon her death, a Los Angeles Times article stated that Almina, quote, had a reputation as a hard-hitting journalist willing to stir controversy with stories on such topics as racial discrimination in Hollywood and police mistreatment of Black people, end quote. Veteran civil rights lawyer Leo Bratton Jr. once stated, quote, "She was a terrific writer, the only one of all of the Black newspapers at the time who really was fearless about exposing things as they were. She didn't soft pedal anything," end quote. Hallie Almina Davis was born in Galveston, Texas in 1915. She attended public schools in Chicago before her family relocated to California during the Depression era. Almina graduated from Jordan High School in Los Angeles and studied journalism for a little over a year at Los Angeles City College.
I was surprised because I think I have.
During this time, Almina was not hired for any jobs at major daily newspapers. Next slide, please. However, in 1938, she began working at a Black weekly newspaper called the California Eagle under the tutelage of pioneering journalist, publisher, and civil rights activist, Charlotta A. Bass. A couple of years later, Almina started the Los Angeles Tribune in 1941 after borrowing $100 from her future father-in-law, Lucius W. Lomax Sr., who was the proprietor of the legendary Dunbar Hotel in Los Angeles, which eventually became the headquarters for the newspaper. Next slide, please. While the newspaper served the Black community in Los Angeles, its readership, as well as its staff, was diverse. One staff writer and friend to Almina was Hisaye Yamamoto, best known for her short story compilation, 17 Syllables. In 1946, Almina won the first prize in the Wendell L. Wiki Awards for Negro Journalism, which was sponsored by the Washington Post for her provocative writing. During the 1940s and 50s, the Tribune grew more prominent, as did Almina. In 1952, she served as a delegate in the Democratic Convention. Additionally, she was the first Black journalist to be accredited by the Motion Picture Academy, and she led boycotts for such movies as Porgy and Bess and Imitation of Life, because she believed they, quote, libeled the Negro race, end quote. Next slide, please. After her divorce, Almina shut down the Tribune in 1960, and she took her 6 children to live in Tuskegee, Alabama, where she briefly published another newspaper, which was also called the Tribune. In a piece published in The Nation magazine in 1961, Almina wrote, quote, Negroes who lead or who can lead have any, or who have any motivation at all toward bettering the world for mankind, need to go often into the teeth of Jim Crow and know it for its brutal, dehumanizing reality, end quote. She wrote extensively about the Jim Crow South, the Montgomery bus boycott, and her interactions with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Next slide. A copy of a letter from Dr. King to Almina is included in the book, The Papers of Martin Luther King Jr., Volume 3, where he wrote, I have been following your articles on Montgomery very closely. They represent journalism at its best, end quote. Around this time in the 1960s, Almina began to write a memoir, which was later turned into a fictionalized account of her life entitled The Women of Montgomery, that was never published. However, she also wrote many essays and short stories which appeared in magazines such as Harper's and Ebony. After living in Tuskegee, Alabama for about a year, she relocated to Northern California and worked as a reporter for the San Francisco Examiner, where she covered stories such as the kidnapping of Patty Hearst and the hunt for Angela Davis. Next slide. Almina had 6 children, including Dr. Michael Lomax, president and CEO of the United Negro College Fund, and former husband of playwright Pearl Clay. Both of their papers can also be found at the Rose Library. In 2018, when the Time's Up movement was formed, Almina was profiled in Time magazine for a short story about movies and activism. Almina died in Pasadena, California in 2011. Next slide. Thank you for your interest. And up next is Amanda Moreno, archivist for the Cuban Heritage Collection at the University of Miami Libraries.
Thank you, Jina. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I wanted to start my presentation with very brief comments to contextualize the historical landscape between Cuba and the US. Political tensions between the US and Cuba run deep, from calls for US annexation of the island in the early 1800s to America's intervention in the nascent country's independence movements in the waning years of Cuba's colonial period and American economic dominance in Cuba in the early 20th century. During its first years as a new nation, Cuba experienced political unrest, student and labor protests, and armed revolts that led to toppled presidencies and culminated in Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. The Cuban Revolution ushered in a period of political and economic changes to life on the island that led to the mass exodus of over 1.3 million people since 1959. Most Cuban immigrants have settled in Miami, forming a diasporic community that is politically, socially, and economically diverse. Political protest went hand in hand with the development of Cuba as a nation state and has continued both on the island and in the diaspora ever since. The archive is full of evidence of these events. Photographs of protests document the people's resistance to injustice and authoritarianism and the complicated connection between homeland and diaspora. The through line of these artifacts of resistance is a cry for liberty and freedom, both on the island and in the diaspora, across politics and ideologies. Our documentation of these movements has shifted to not only include the visual image, but also to preserve the digital traces of our lives shared online. The Cuban Heritage Collection has been collecting Twitter data since 2014, gathering content on a variety of topics, including changes in American foreign policy toward Cuba, Cubans and COVID-19, and protest movements such as the Movimiento San Isidro and the current protests on the island. For the purposes of the zine, I wanted to highlight more contemporary moments of protests in Havana, New York, and Miami. I'll now share some images that I hope will serve as historical vignettes for Cuban protests in the global Cuban story. Next slide, please. 1980, Cubans stormed the Peruvian embassy in Havana, seeking asylum and an opportunity to leave the island. Cuban Americans in Miami rally in Little Havana to support the asylum seekers with banners shouting for freedom. Viva Cuba Libre, en pie de lucha, 10 millones esperan por nosotros. Slide. 1992. 10,000 anti-Castro protesters, including several hundred from Miami, marched to New York's Jacob Javits Convention Center to protest a Peace for Cuba rally, calling for Fidel Castro's removal from power. The activists at the Peace for Cuba rally advocated for the end of economic sanctions and lifting of travel restrictions against Cuba, while the anti-Castro protesters favored the continuation of the embargo. No more dictator. Slide. 2003, protesters in Miami gather in a march for freedom and dignity to oppose dialogue and an opening of relations between Cuba and the US. Banners at the march show images of Elian Gonzalez, referring to the young child who 3 years earlier had been the center of an immigration and custody controversy that created conflict between the Miami Cuban community and Washington, D.C. No more dialogue, keep the blockade, 22 de abril, tragedia viviente del exilio cubano. Slide, please. 2018 to 2019. Cuban artists, journalists, and academics, including rapper Dennis Solis and performance artist Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, formed the Movimiento San Isidro to protest government censorship of artistic expression. Hashtag La Bandera es de todos. Slide. 2020, the death of Hansel Hernandez, an Afro-Cuban man, at the hands of Cuban police, sparked months of peaceful protests from June to December. Protesters were critical of police brutality and racism and called for the release of political prisoners. In November, over 300 artists and intellectuals protested in front of the Cuban Ministry of Culture in Havana in response to the arrest of Dennis Solis on November 27th. The group rejects repression and violence by the state, along with members of Movimiento San Isidro. Hashtag RBS-Mellon. Slide. 2021. In a new anti-government protest, Cubans across the island gathered in the streets chanting freedom and calling for President Miguel Díaz-Canel to step down from office in July. The Cuban police responded with violence against protesters. The protests took place in the context of surging coronavirus infections, a weakened economy, shortage of basic goods, and curtailing of civil liberties. Many Cubans in the diaspora rallied in support of the protesters, with some even calling for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Attempts to protest continued throughout the year. Hashtag OnceJ, hashtag SOS Cuba, hashtag Patria y Vida. And here you can see an example of the Twitter data that we collect as part of our efforts to document these protest movements. The impulse to preserve a community's cultural memory goes beyond national borders. In my work, I try to reflect on the inherently interpretive aspect of the formation of archives, how communities create collective memory, and how archival professionals impact what is preserved for posterity through our collecting and descriptive practices. As a Cuban American memory worker, I think about what it means to collect the heritage of a place so divided by ideology and fractured by time, of a pre-revolutionary Cuba that continues to exist only in the minds of my elders, of the Cuba of my imagination, of the Cuba of today. Next slide. Thank you all very much. I'm very happy to introduce our next presenter, Jensen Ortiz, the librarian at the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Amanda, for the intro. I'm going to be discussing a selection of photographs from the Normandia Maldonado collection, which I chose to feature in the zine at the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute archives during the early years of the Dominican Day Parade in the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, New York. Normandia was a folklorist, a community activist, and one of the important leaders among the Dominican community in New York City. Next slide. The first annual Dominican Day Parade and Festival was held on August 15th, 1982. And picture here's the flyer, the first flyer that was produced alongside a photo that was taken near the start of the parade on 165th Street and Audubon Avenue. The parade coincides with the anniversary of the start of the Dominican Restoration War, which is depicted on the flyer, against Spain between 1863 and 1865. Ultimately, the Dominican Republic won the war in 1865, gaining their freedom. The concept of a Dominican Day Parade came from a local community activist by the name of Miguel Amaro in 1981, who wanted to match other existing ethnic parades in the city at the time. He thought a parade would be an empowering resource to enhance the visibility of the community as a social force in the city. However, Miguel needed the help of established leaders within the Dominican community to make it happen. Normandia Maldonado happened to be one of those established leaders who migrated in the early 1960s and were some of the original committee members of the parade. Next slide.
Oh, Jensen.
Vincent, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So many political activists the following year began to foresee the continuity of the Dominican community in the city and felt that parade as an institution should be used as a platform to address the social and political issues affecting Dominicans in the United States and in the Dominican Republic. Some of the criticism of the first parade were published in the local press at the time, like you see here in this news clipping, and called for the transformation of the parade into one that was representative of all sectors of the community, regardless of political, social, or religious position. The picture here is of a banner from the New York City branch of the Communist Party of Labor, expressing the solidarity against the Simpson-Mazzoli bill in 1983. Next slide. This next photo features a banner from one of the first Dominican community centers established in Washington Heights, the Caribbean Educational Center, which was founded in 1970 by former Union leader Alfredo White, who was also an ex-combatant of the Dominican Civil War in 1965, to help immigrants adjust to U.S. society by learning English and teaching them about the American political system. As you can see here, they were addressing not just the Simpson-Mazzoli bill, but also a lot of the issues affecting Dominicans in the United States at the time. The center lasted until 1992. Next slide. Here we have another community-based voluntary association called the Community Association for Progressive Dominicans, which was founded in 1980, 2 years prior to the start of the Dominican Day Parade, with the purpose of organizing tenants in the neighborhood and also providing social service to community residents, specifically children through after-school programs. The ACDP, as it was called, will later play an important role as a springboard for the political incorporation of Dominicans in local city politics.
Could you please repeat it?
In the decade. Next slide. Here we have another photo from the Dominican Left Front, leftist party and their branch in New York City, responding to the political and economic situation in the Dominican Republic. Then Dominican President Salvador Jorge Blanco has sent the military to quell the street violence and assassinate young militants in the Dominican Republic who were protesting the economic development agreement with the International Monetary Fund in the summer of 1983. Next slide. So this last photo demonstrates the solidarity from non-Dominican organizations who joined the parade, like the Latin American Economists in New York, to bring awareness and also propose a new solution to the debt crisis that was affecting not just the Dominican Republic, but all of Latin America and the Caribbean during the 1980s. So next slide. I just want to add that this part of the history is part of Dominican community organizing, and the Dominican Day Parade was sort of an offshoot of that, and that's why I wanted to feature that in the zine. Thank you, and next we have Keala Richard, a conservation technician at the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our presentations. I'm Kayla Richard, and I'm a conservation technician for Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. And though this is a rare book school presentation, the problems I'm discussing are not unique to the field of rare books. I believe it's important for us to recognize our position in existing structural hierarchies so we can work together to address legacies of exclusion and create a more equitable field. I'm going to stress that I'm an early career technician, and this presentation discusses issues that I have experienced in the field and serves as an extension of my own personal reflections on my professional practice. Next. The complicated history of the conservation profession. So preservation as a field was born out of a paternalistic perceived need to remove objects from native cultures in order to better protect them. Today, scholars and heritage professionals and museum institutions recognize that their entire fields are complicit in the visible erasure of narratives that did not fit a Western Eurocentric gaze. Fields like anthropology actively position non-Western cultures as inferior or other, which justified the outright cultural theft that filled museum collections. Conservator Sanchita Balachandran, Associate Director of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, says, scholars in museum studies have acknowledged that the museum was fully embedded in the colonial and imperial enterprise, and its daily processes perpetuated this colonialism and racism and asserted the dominance of white Euro-American cultures over others. It's not a stretch to say that libraries and archives have been guilty of the same thing, asserting Euro-American dominance over the surviving cultural narrative with their collecting and preservation practices. Next. Legacies of inequity shape our identities as conservators. So let's look at some demographic data. In 1993, the American Institute for Conservation, or AIC, undertook a survey which broke down membership by gender and race. Respondents were 0.05% American Indian or Alaska Native, 1.7% Asian or Pacific Islander, 0.5% Black, 9.2% Hispanic, and 95.1% white. Next. 20 years later, in 2013, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation commissioned a demographic survey of museum professionals, and in it, approximately 87% self-reported as white. Next. So we can diversify the profession by decentralizing the way that we approach the field. The findings of the 1994 AIC Diversity Task Force suggested that we introduce minority kids to conservation at an early age through outreach programming and targeted K-12 teaching efforts. A 2017 AIC Equity and Inclusion Working Group report made recommendations like assessing the conservation field's educational pathways and early career employment models as they affect underrepresented racial and cultural groups. Now, traditionally, conservation was built on an apprenticeship model where the skill was learned by trade. Now, the industry standard is an expensive advanced degree, and even so, there are only 6 programs in the entire US. If we can nurture interest in the paraprofessional level and be willing to acknowledge extensive bench training as an acceptable credential, we can broaden access to the field for those who might find the established pathway inaccessible. The 2017 report also recommended that we continue to grow financial assistance for professional development specific to emerging underrepresented cultural and racial professionals, and emerging conservators should be targeted specifically to increase retention in the field. We need to increase advocacy and partnerships with allied and international professionals and continue to encourage professional development across all career levels. Next. So we can respect traditional methods for repairs, uses, and the cultural needs of our objects. Cultural heritage is inexorably linked to cultural property, and we cannot divorce the native cultural significance from preservation efforts, otherwise we risk the erasure of cultures themselves. Next. In 2019, I attended the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, or ATALM conference. And whenever I meet with people outside the profession, I'm always asked about treating rare material. But this time I was bombarded with questions about appropriate handling of archival collections, specifically treaties. I had a conversation with one tribal elder about a recent trip to DC where a delegation was sent to view the National Archives series, Indian Treaties, 1722 to 1869. Elders had hoped to view and perform an approved ceremony for their tribe's treaty under archivist supervision, but they were told that they could look but not touch the items in storage and were instead directed to digital surrogates. As important documents holding sacred history, these tribal elders were beyond disheartened and felt that though they were willing to accept US custody of their treaty, impeding access to such an important piece of their cultural property was wrong. And to me, this illustrates a need for conservation outreach training, especially to Indigenous communities, to help teach proper rare materials handling. And Native communities have a right to access objects for their history, and we as conservators have a responsibility to remove obstacles to access. Next. So the reality is that our collecting practices shape our historical narrative. It's our responsibility to wield that power in such a way that we are creating collections that accurately and fairly represent the communities we live in. This often means making choices about painful history. So I am sometimes asked to treat racist material, and it's a reality of the job that I struggle with. I ask myself, why is this item being selected for treatment? Why is this more important to preserve than something from a marginalized community? And often the answer is just that it's an important text for scholars. But I believe that it's just as important to preserve the positive cultural output and legacies of communities of color as it is to preserve the painful past. Next. In 2019, I received on my bench probably the most disgusting book I've ever gotten for treatment. It's called KKK, Friend or Foe, and in it, the author argues that the Klan is fundamentally misunderstood and a force for positive moral influence. It's disgusting. But inside was an ephemeral clipping from a letter to the editor of a newspaper. The content concerns a previously published article where a collector wrote in asking about the value of the book and praised it as a must-read. But the author of the letter condemns the book and its subject matter, and he says it's the bigotry and lawlessness, and asks, can we afford to have our feet planted in the muck and slime of hatred? And I love that line, because without it, I don't think I could bring myself to treat the book. We have such limited resources and so little time. I question why this book would be worth all of that. But when paired with the clipping, it tells a story of contemporary resistance that would be lost were they to be disassociated. The pairing of this clipping with the book gave me hope that my efforts will be properly contextualized, and I am preserving not just the legacy of hatred, but of positive social resistance. So addressing inequity in conservation requires a holistic look at the profession, our collections, and our practices. And positive change can only come through diversifying the face of the profession, reevaluating the needs of our collections, establishing ethical collecting practices, and prioritizing a more inclusive narrative. I hope that I've given you some ideas to consider for the next time you send something from your collection to conservation. Thank you. And next up, I would like to introduce Crystal Trivett, Curator for Orange County Regional History at UC Irvine.
Thank you, Kayala, for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. As Kayala mentioned, my name is Crystal, and I'm from UC Irvine. UCI Library Special Collections and Archives has one of, if not the largest comprehensive collection of Orange County history in the region. That said, we, like many other repositories, have work to do to highlight and support materials and collections that tell lesser known histories, particularly the stories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have shaped the county. I've learned that when the general public, meaning those usually outside the region, think about Orange County, a conservative, affluent, predominantly white, formerly agricultural hub turned mecca of master plan communities, often comes to mind. Pamphlets, flyers, and newsletters can share a more nuanced history of the county that includes our BIPOC communities and their political and social activism. For our zine, I chose to highlight the story of Frank Schuford, to call attention to the consequences and coalition building of community organizing in the Black community that lived in Santa Ana, California in the 1970s. At that time, Santa Ana was the home and cultural hub of about 4% of the 1% of Orange County's Black residents. Nicknamed Little Texas, the Black Santa Ana community was vibrant with churches, clubs, beauty salons, and barbershops, and barbecue restaurants. The community thrived in spite of redlining. Frank Schuford was a Black community organizer in the area who led the Community Youth Council. The council organized community activities, tutoring, free lunch programs, and a drill team, as well as stood up against policing and drug activity in the area. Next slide, please. Shortly after beginning his campaign in 1974 to stop the drug activity in the city, Schuford was accused of a non-fatal shooting that occurred while he was at home with friends and family. His first trial ended in a hung jury. Adamant about his innocence, Schubert refused to accept a plea deal that would have resulted in a 5-year sentence. At his second trial, an all-white jury convicted him to 30 years in prison for assault with intent to commit murder. According to various accounts, there was little evidence produced against Schubert at either trial. Eyewitnesses were not called to the stand. One of the victims perjured himself, and Schubert's attorney in the second trial took a job as an assistant district attorney for Orange County immediately after his conviction. In this slide, I want to call attention to a quote by Schubert that calls out what he believed was the motivation for his arrest. It was the capitalists that railroaded me into prison because our organizing in working class communities. It is important to strip the veil from people's eyes to combat brainwashing and whitewashing by the system. Next slide, please. Many agreed with Schubert, believing that his framing and conviction was an attempt by those in power in Orange County to attack the Black community and working class in the region, especially those who attempted to fight for independent political action and civil rights. Schubert's case did not quiet the activism. It helped build coalitions and validated the need for justice. The Frank Schubert Defense Committee was a community-based organization of Black and white people, mainly from Santa Ana, focused on advocating for Schubert's freedom. In addition to its support for Schubert, the Defense Committee, with support from the Socialist Organizing Committee of Orange County, advocated for other civil rights concerns, including US intervention in Angola, the harassment of undocumented Mexican workers, the oppression of women, and the struggle for national liberation in the Third World. In this slide, you see a page from a Defense Committee newsletter, which highlighted massive support for Schubert. Hundreds showed up at a free Frank Schubert rally in June 1976. Next slide, please. Despite efforts, the coalition of Schubert allies were unable to win his freedom. The Schubert Defense Committee noted the challenge of developing a strong support base in a hostile county. And Schubert's Community Youth Council fell apart after people saw what became of those in Orange County who took the lead for change. Still, there are successes worth noting. The Schubert Defense Committee was at the time one of the few multinational and multi-gendered organizations in the county in which women and Black people had major leadership roles. Furthermore, the committee was able to bring local and national publicity to Schubert's case and his message, victory and freedom for all oppressed people. Next slide. Thank you. It comes as no surprise that students are positively impacted when they're able to see themselves represented in the archival materials. At UCI, we have been committed to advocating for community-centered archives practice, which emphasizes the ability of those underrepresented in the archives, including our students, to claim the roles of archivists and curators by being records creators. Sharing materials like newsletters, flyers, and pamphlets shown during this presentation help to make the ability to build archives through collecting the materials of everyday and activist life more tangible. Zines, archival materials in their own right are a great teaching tool. I look forward to using the zine we've created in the classroom to highlight stories like Schubert's. Now I would like to turn the program back over to Crystal Apia, who will moderate the Q&A.
Great, thank you. Would you please join me in giving a virtual applause to our panelists? We got a reaction. Thank you. Those were wonderful stories, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to digging more deeply into the zine. And you can download a copy from the Rare Book School's website to have your own copy to share. And so now, if you have some questions for the panelists, please feel free to throw them in the chat. But I did want to start off by asking a question. You know, all of you have taken a Rare Book School class as part of the fellowship. Did any of you have any takeaways from the classes that you like to share, something you applied to your own work, or something that you as a BIPOC archives professional brought to those classes that sort of helped to enhance the experience of the other students and faculty within those Rare Book School classes?
I can start.
Okay, thanks, Amanda.
Sure. So last summer I took the Identifying Photographic Print Processes course. And my goal for taking that class was to be able to date historic photographs We've been doing a lot of work at the Cuban Heritage Collection around materials related to enslavement. And we were curious to find materials related to Afro-Cuban experiences, and by knowing the date and more mechanical information about the mechanics of the image, I think we can do some interesting work to kind of help us understand more about Afro-Cuban experiences from different time periods.
Thank you. Would any of the other fellows like to share any takeaways or their contributions to those classes?
I can go.
Okay.
So I took the Chinese rare books course last summer, specifically because one of the branches I work with is the Freer-Sackler Gallery, now called the Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art. And they have a lot of things in non-Western formats that our conservators, even our senior conservators, are not comfortable working with. And so I had hoped to learn more about book structures, pigments and materials, things like that, that I could then bring back into my lab and help teach other people, so that they don't have to send those materials out to specialists anymore. They can be integrated into our workflows. So that was really awesome. And it's also really special to me because my whole career trajectory is to eventually learn as much as I can and go home to Hawaii. And rare books look very different in Hawaii because there's the strong Asian influence, and you have a lot of Japanese, Korean, and Chinese rare books in collections. And so this was an opportunity for me to kind of expand my expertise and learn something that is very, very specific to my own personal career goals.
Thank you.
I could go.
Okay.
I took a course, an introduction to audiovisual management. Back in 2015, I started a vinyl collection at the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute Library, and it's been teaching. It really helped to get a better sense of what I was curating and how to really continue preserving the collection, because I was away from the collection for about a year and a half. And so when I came back in 2021, things were in disarray and I had to scramble, and I think to preserve some of the recordings. And the class really helped me with that. So
Thank you.
I took Joel Silver's reference resources for researching rare books, and he inspired me to start a reference wall in our department, which we didn't formally have, which is great because now, I mean, we're still in the middle of it, but now we'll be able to actually find out more information about some of the rare books we have, because a lot of that isn't readily available outside of some of these bibliographies. So I highly recommend Joel Silver's class.
Thank you. So I have another question then. For any of the panelists, did your approach to community outreach change during the pandemic? And if so, how?
You know, I don't know if it changed as much as it kind of ramped up. It seems really odd because we were in a pandemic and a lot of things were closed. And so I think this thinking that, you know, it's the in-person connection that can really bring us together. But actually, I think it was really all that was going on in the United States around social justice and advocacy that really, I think, brought us together with people in a way that just, you know, hadn't happened previously because of really the, I want to say the urgency of the moment, but I think it continues now, which I'm relieved, thrilled about, because I think I was afraid that, once there didn't seem to be an urgency or the top, I guess the highlight of the day, short attention span from people would shift away from social concerns, that some of the interest in collaborating and doing the work of community archives and archival building around collections that are underrepresented would slow, but it hasn't. So I think the future is really looking up in that area.
I saw a marked difference in just my ability to do more outreach, instead of sitting on the reference desk for hours and hours a week. I got to work on building research guides. I got to have more research consultations with our researchers who were realizing that they maybe just needed to talk to somebody about their research rather than worrying about how they were going to afford flying to New York and coming to do research. So it really opened more possibilities for our researchers to connect with a person, to talk about archives, to talk about their research, and forced us to get more creative in meeting those needs with free scan and deliver services, and talking to students virtually during virtual class visits. So it was a strong pivot, but such a welcome one. It was, yeah, I learned so much and know I reached a lot more people during the pandemic.
Thank you.
It was really great. I mean, it was a good opportunity for us to pivot our programming to virtual. So we did a lot more work with different communities that way, and we reached a much wider audience. And as Bridgett was saying, like a lot of our instruction sessions were moved to virtual for about a year. And it was interesting to kind of puzzle out how to make primary source instruction like interesting in a virtual format where students can't like handle the material, and that was such an exciting part of what they used to be able to do with us. Now we're back to that, but it made us sort of rethink our workflows and how we interacted with the community, which was a nice opportunity.
Thanks. Anyone else like to share?
I do have a question if I'm allowed. So thank you so much for the wonderful presentations and for all the hard work you put not only in the presentations and the programs today, but also in the zine and the contents. And I'm wondering, since this is a group effort and all of you have such different insights into the different materials that you've been working with, what kind of tips would you give to other cultural heritage professionals who would be interested in doing zines as a way of increasing community outreach from their institutions?
If I may, at the Schomburg Center, I was offering quite a few zine workshops before the pandemic, and was able to have one since returning. And it's been a really beautiful way to connect with users of all ages, backgrounds, abilities, interests, to provide an opportunity to follow their interests, whether that's by inviting them into the archive to do research beforehand or preparing a lesson and facsimiles of archival materials for them to then cut up and paste and do collages. I've done a series of zine workshops where we've had students creating class zines where everyone would make a page or two, much like our zine that we shared with you all today. But you can also let students or visitors create their own mini zines, whether it's just one sheet of paper that's folded into 4, 8, 16 pages, whatever you're comfortable with. Zines are flexible. They can do whatever you need them to do. They're easy to make, very low budget. So if all you've got is a pencil and a piece of paper, you can make a zine with that. So it's a really wonderful tool to use for outreach when we don't have large budgets for programming. And it just invites your users to be creative, to tell their own story about interacting with your materials or reflecting on their visit to your institution. So again, zines can go any way that your public wants them to.
I would say that I think it really helps when the content that you're profiling in the zine is something that you're interested in. It makes it a lot more fun. I think all of us kind of have a personal little, we can relate some way to our collections in some way, or for the one that I picked, I know Jessica, you mentioned that you used to live in Oakland. So, you know, there was a connection there. And then as far as the one that I picked about Almina Lomax, I lived in Southern California and also lived in Montgomery, Alabama as well. So I was just like, ooh, I definitely have to do this one. But also she had an amazing journalistic career. So I think that helps makes it more fun and interesting for anyone. If you're creating the zine, your students creating the zine or patrons, it makes it that much more fun.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that everyone else has said so far. And I'd add that you might be surprised at how quick it goes, because I know for many of us, when we were like, okay, we have to find images and we have to write like a little essay or some kind of, reflection piece, it felt intimidating to write something out. But in reality, because the zine is, an 8.5 by 11 page folded in half, you really can't fit that much text in there, especially because you want the font to be readable when it's printed. So the font we used was size 15. You could probably get away with maybe 13, 14, but really like each page can only fit 250 characters, not even words, characters. So, you might be surprised that it doesn't feel as daunting. It's not as daunting to accomplish as it may seem at the beginning. It's actually really doable, especially as a collective.
Thank you for that. I also wonder, how did you arrive at the idea of a zine as opposed to other kinds of projects?
Majority rules? I don't know. Was it that easy? We had a few ideas. I don't recall. I think that's kind of how it happened. Does anyone else remember?
I think there was the idea of doing a podcast, but then like coordinating the equipment and like that made things complicated. So we settled on the zine format as something that's accessible and that we can all contribute to.
I think it worked really well because there was a few of us, you can probably know which of us, who are really into zines, right? Who like are familiar with them and comfortable with them. There were some of us that this was their first time working with a zine or making a zine. So this was nice because the more experienced people could kind of help, and kind of take that extra step of like creating the layout once the person sends them their content. So it was something that was accessible to everyone at any stage. And it was also something we could work on asynchronously because we're across like 3 time zones, right? There's multiple time zones represented in our group. So we just needed something that was doable remotely, that could still be really effective and impactful. And I think it did turn out that way.
Thank you so much.
If you have advice for other BIPOC archives professionals for making connections with others. Like often people feel isolated within their institution or their geographical location or a specialization like Keala of conservation. Do you have any advice you would give to others, whether students or further along in their career, to find other BIPOC people to be peer support or mentors?
I personally am a fan of just knocking on doors and just going to anybody with skills or with a position or potential mentorship potential that you think you can see, and asking outright, especially in BIPOC communities, because I think we have shared experiences and there is a level of understanding where most people I find are happy to have a conversation. They're happy to point you in the right direction. And I've gotten very, very lucky in that I've had mentors really take me under their wing and show me new skills, or give me tools that I can use to go on and practice. But none of that would have happened if I didn't make the first move and ask. So don't be afraid to ask, I guess is my advice.
I would also plug the We Here community, which is a library community of library workers of color. And they have multiple platforms in which you can connect with other folks in not just library world, but the entire kind of GLAM profession. And I've found so much support and camaraderie within that group. And also, yeah, just programs such as these, which have been so instrumental in kind of fostering those collaborative relationships and allowing us to work on projects like this, which kind of take us out of our institutions and allow us to, work with folks all over the country.
The Joint Conference of Librarians of Color is coming up in this fall, I think in September or October, and it only happens every couple of years. But if you are ready to start traveling, this might be a great opportunity to take advantage of the upcoming conference.
Do you have any of you have questions for each other about the Zine contributions or presentations that you gave? Put each other on the hot spot.
One thing that I'd be interested in hearing is how folks would approach having students work on this or patrons work on a project in which the zine is the final outcome, because we had a period of weeks to work on this and a lot of instruction sessions are kind of one shot. So I'm kind of wondering, in terms of like a start to finish lesson plan, how you would envision zine making to happen in that context.
In my experience, I've had a group of fourth graders come who were reading a book, One Crazy Summer, and they came to the Schomburg Center. I gave a lesson on the Black Panther Party and then gave them images of the Black Panther Party. I broke them into groups and assigned each group one of the prompts for the 10-point program, and they made a zine reflecting on the book that they were reading and the point that they were assigned. We had 90 minutes to do that. So that's just one example. You can also have less structure if you wanted and just have them reflect on Black joy, for example, and give them magazines to cut up or images you've downloaded from your digital repositories or anything like that. You could also have a session where they're doing research in your reading room and snapping photographs of collections, if that's allowed, and have them make a digital zine at home that maybe the instructor then sends to you, so you can add to your collection maybe. So there's it again, it's very flexible, but I found 90 minutes to be a good amount of time that allowed for creativity to happen without having it drag on all day. But you know, all day Zine workshop, that sounds like fun to me.
I haven't gotten to run a zine workshop yet, but if I did, off the top of my head, I feel like what I would want to do is spend probably, have like a 2-hour session or 1.5-hour session, and spend the first half like having the students look at the actual archival material, interact with it, talk about its history, and then the second half have reproductions of everything already printed and done, and then just let them go wild, right? Cutting up things, creating a single page. I really think just doing a one page is what you can do in a one-shot session like that. And then at the very end, putting them all together to create a collaborative zine. I think that would be cool because then they can see the real thing, touch the real thing, and then kind of put their own spin on it, right? At the end.
There's a comment in the chat that a fellow in Chronicling Resistance did a zine workshop combining magazines and copies of archival material that took about 2 hours or so. So looks like there's some really great ideas about how to get started with this.
I have a question for the group.
Oh, sure.
What are everyone's plans for like continuing to collect stories of resistance in their communities?
We have big plans here at UCI. We recently received a Mellon Fellowship to continue our work in community-centered archives partnerships, and that's a 4-year grant, and it just started like this month. So we've got a few years plus, because we don't want it just to be something we do for 4 years, where we will be working with not just community-based organizations in our region, but also reaching out to for regional and national partners who want to figure out how to do this work at a variety of scales. So yeah, got a lot of positive things happening here. I'm really excited about it.
I'll just add that while I don't get to do collections or purchasing in my role, I kind of see my role as the long-term game, because I'm all about community engagement and outreach. So building the relationships, right? That kind of fostering that connection to people that will hopefully open the doors for future acquisitions. So just laying the groundwork. But the way that I see it is just continuing to build connections by attending events, meeting with people one-on-one, keeping in touch with one another, sharing whenever we get materials that are relevant to them, keeping them engaged with what we're doing with those materials so that they're always feeling connected and, just kept up to date. So the housework side of things.
Really important work, Sandy.
Any last thoughts? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was gonna say the Los Angeles Public Library is gonna be hosting a Memory Lab boot camp next week. And we are bringing in librarians from 8 other public libraries throughout the state that are hoping to create a memory labs like the one that LAPL created a few years ago as part of the first Memory Lab cohort with the DC Public Library. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Memory Lab is a publicly accessible transfer station. So patrons, they can transfer VHS, mini DVs, many different types of formats, as well as paper-based and transmissive materials. And we teach personal archiving and digital preservation workshops as part of this. And another component to it too that we're working on in collaboration with California Revealed, who's overseeing this grant for the boot camp, is encouraging patrons to contribute their stories to the institutions where they're doing the transfers, and also to the California Revealed digital collections portal. Yeah, I'm really excited about seeing more memory labs in the state, because we've had some people traveling from other counties to use the LAPL memory lab.
Thank you so much. I think if anyone in the audience has an additional question, you're more than welcome to ask at this point. Okay, if we don't have any additional questions, I think that probably we can wrap up for today. And I will leave the group and Crystal to thank guests and close the meeting for today.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating. And again, thank you to Rare Book School for hosting the zine and the fellowship. If you have questions for any of the fellows who didn't get their contact information, just feel free to contact Rare Book School, and we'll get you in contact with the fellows. But thank you so much for taking the time to spend the afternoon with us. Everyone have a good rest of the day.